Does Jesus, in any of the four Gospels, ever say anything about homosexuality?
No. And there are people who point to Matthew 19 and say, well, Jesus quoted Genesis 2:24, and Jesus said that, what God has put together, let no man divide asunder. And so Jesus is, defining marriage as between one man and one woman. And so that is against homosexuality. And that is a very creative but very nonsensical overinterpretation of what Jesus is saying, because Jesus is just talking about divorce and is quoting Genesis 2:24 to say God wants these pair bonds, and so don't break those bonds because God wants them. So that has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with homosexuality.
Dr. Daniel McClellan is an independent scholar of the Bible and religion and an honorary fellow at the University of Birmingham's Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. He's the winner of the Society of Biblical Literature's 2023 Richards Award for Public Scholarship. And on top of all this, he has a fantastic and fantastically popular TikTok and YouTube channels where he tackles common questions and misunderstandings about the Bible. Dr. McClellan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
An absolute pleasure. Getting ready for this interview, I quickly realized one thing that kind of shocked me. I was raised Catholic. I'm not religious anymore, but I did go to what back home in Slovenia we call verouk, or some sort of Catholic Bible school, for 8 years. I also did all the Catholic sacraments, baptism, confirmation, etc. But even so, I never ever, not even once, actually read the Bible. And I didn't realize that until very recently. What actually opened my eyes was a stand-up bit, of all things. I forgot who it was from exactly. I think it might have been Bill Burr, because he's Catholic. I watched it a while back, and during the bit, he says that he has for the first time just read the Bible at the ripe age of 53 or something. And that's because usually in Catholicism, they don't encourage you to read the Bible at all. In fact, if you try to do so, they're like, no, put that down. Let me tell you what happened. Don't read that, because if you read that, you're going to get confused and you're going to get it wrong. So I'm going to tell you instead. And so we didn't read it. Even at Sunday Mass, you'd have these pre-selected choice passages read out, that would be interpreted by the priest. So in short, I really have no clue what's actually in the Bible and what's not in the Bible. So I'm going to have some very basic questions for you.
That's perfectly fine.
Let's maybe begin with the Old Testament. I do realize it probably happened in various different stages and historical contexts. But how and when were the Old Testament books written or compiled into its current form?
So that's two different phases, and you're right that it covers a very large chronological window. Probably the earliest literary layers in the Bible are some fragments of poetry that come in places like Judges 5 and Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 68, places like that. And that poetry may go back to around 1000 BCE, but it would have initially been transmitted either inscription or orally. You don't get historical narrative in the Hebrew language until around 850, 800 BCE. So a couple hundred years later, they start using this language to write historical narrative. And shortly after this time period, we probably have the original versions of some of the narratives that we know from the Hebrew Bible. The Exodus tradition, in some way, shape, or form, probably began to circulate as text around this time period. The stories about Jacob and the northern kingdom of Israel probably start to circulate in textual form around this time period. In the 8th century, so 700 to 799 BCE, somewhere around there, we begin to have prophets writing down texts. So these are the famous 8th century prophets, or at least the historical parts of those texts. So Isaiah and Micah and others like that, are probably writing texts in the 8th century. And then as we get into the 7th and the 6th centuries BCE, the focus shifts from the northern kingdom of Israel to the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom is actually destroyed by the kingdom of Assyria. And so focus shifts to the southern kingdom. And this is where we begin to have folks like the Judahite king Josiah begins to take some of the historical records that were probably being kept for the rulers of the nation, starts to craft those into what we now know as the book of Deuteronomy. And we start to see some law codes being written. And then we get the exile, where the Judahites are forcibly exiled to Babylon, which starts around 600 BCE and goes to around 539 BCE. And then we have a bunch of people coming back into Israel, writing texts, Ezra, Nehemiah. We have more legal texts. We have more royal propaganda. And then we get into the Greco-Roman period, and we have wisdom literature. So Persian Greco-Roman period, things like Job, things like Proverbs, things like this begin to be written. And then probably the very last text that was finished in what we now consider the Hebrew Bible is the book of Daniel, which is supposed to be set during the exile, but was actually probably mostly written between the Persian and Greco-Roman periods and was probably finalized in the early 160s BCE. And so we got a bunch of different genres of text written by a bunch of different people, from prophets to priests to kings to scribes, probably originating around 1000 BCE, and then the final texts were probably composed in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. And it's probably being compiled around this time period as well. Some scholars today think that these were not all widely available. Like your average person on the street probably had never read any of these texts. They might have heard some of them, but certainly not most, much less all of them. And it's probably around the time that Israel, the people of Judea are able to defeat the Hellenistic Seleucid kingdom in battle and establish their own kingdom that we call the Hasmonean kingdom in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, probably in an effort to try to enforce a shared identity and kind of draw boundaries around that identity. They may have begun to share these texts more widely and enforce the legislation that is in them. So you don't have widespread knowledge of these texts until probably the middle of the 2nd century BCE. And that's probably when the arrangement that we now know was formalized. So long process. A lot of these texts that may originate between 1000 and 800 BCE have been edited and redacted numerous times over that whole process. So lots of things have changed. But the text as we know it now probably compiled in the form more or less as we know it now, probably in the early to mid 2nd century BCE.
So a process that was spanning 800 years. Different genres, from poetry, like you said, to royal propaganda. Who had the idea, if we know anything about that, let's put all of these very various narratives and different forms of texts into one?
We see this first in the idea of Ezra, when they come back to they're trying to reestablish the temple, and they're trying to get the people of Judea to follow God's law again. And so we have the story in the book of Ezra, which was written somewhere between 400 and 300 BCE, of Ezra reading out the whole book of the law to the people. And this is probably not entirely historical, but any historical features of it probably would have just involved what we now know as the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, some of the law codes in there, maybe. And the idea there seems to be that the people of Judea are trying to distinguish themselves from the larger empires that are around them, that have been putting pressure on them and have been oppressing them since the Babylonian exile, then the Persians were their overlords. Then we had the Hellenistic period, and we had the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were fighting over control of the area. So they always had these other nations that were putting a lot of pressure on them. And so in order to try to create and defend an ethnic identity and keep the other identities away, they used this propaganda and this legislation as a means of saying, here's what a good Judahite does. They don't eat pork. They do these celebrations. They follow these rules. I don't know if you had this situation like I did when I was growing up in my house. My dad used to say things like, "We're McClellans. We do this." And this is like the identity marker. This is how you knew that you were part of the family. And it was always some aspirational thing. But that's a way to say, this is how we draw the line between us and them. And so it was probably folks who were trying to create and curate that identity as a means of protecting their ethnic identity, keeping them together as a group and saying, we are an ethnos, we are an ethnic group. We want to ensure that we survive as an ethnic group. And so we need to distinguish ourselves from everybody else around us. And so the indications are that we probably see that beginning to happen as the Judahites are trying to survive in the land of Judah after the exile. But it really comes to a head when the Judeans are fighting off the Seleucid kingdom, which Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the king who seems determined, according to the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, to stamp out the Judahite culture, to prohibit them from circumcising their sons, to force them to eat pork, to do all this kind of stuff. And so it's probably in that period, which is where we get the tradition of the rededication of the temple, which is now enshrined in the celebration of Hanukkah. That's probably the period where it all comes to a head and where they decide this is who we're going to be. These are the texts that we're going to use to establish our identity. And in terms of who, it's just going to be political leaders, cultic leaders, thought leaders who are concerned not only for their ethnic identity and their ethnic group, but also for their access to power and resources as leaders within that ethnic group. But in terms of names, we don't really have a ton of names that we can identify.
But if it was first and foremost about establishing some sort of cultural identity, why didn't they just articulate some sort of cultural norms? Why does it have to come from God? Where does God feature in all of this?
So this probably has to do with the preservation of a much earlier ideology. In the pre-exilic periods and into the 2nd millennium BCE, every nation had its patron deity. And the patron deity was the one who went out before you in battle to fight your battles for you. And you won or lost based on your patron deity's feelings about you. Like we see this in a text from a king of Moab named Mesha, one of our earliest examples, probably the earliest example of historical narrative prose in an alphabetic script from this area. And Mesha talks about kings of Israel and says that Chemosh, who was the patron deity of Moab, allowed the king of Israel to oppress them, put them under vassalage, demand tribute, all that kind of stuff. And then it explains it on the grounds that Chemosh was angry with his land. In other words, they had done something wrong. They had made their patron deity upset. And so their patron deity says, all right, I'm using this. I'm the puppet master. I'm using this other nation and I'm allowing them to oppress you to teach you a lesson. And we have the exact same rationalizations going on in the Hebrew Bible. And so the deity is the one constant, and you rationalize your successes or your losses based on the deity's basically feelings about you. And so the exile was rationalized as God being angry with Israel because they didn't keep the Sabbath day, because they were worshiping other gods, because they were using idols, divine images. And then in a paper I published in 2018, I argue that Psalm 82 is an attempt to universalize God, because one of the features of this worldview is that every nation's deity is only sovereign within that nation. And now all of the Judahites are outside their nation. They can't access their God. Their God's way off in the land of Israel, and they're way off in the land of Babylon. And so Psalm 82 is this very mythological text where God stands amidst the gods in the divine council and renders judgment and accuses the other gods of iniquity and then condemns them to mortality. And my argument is that this is blaming the gods of the other nations for allowing this exile, condemning the gods of the nations to mortality, and then the very last line of the psalm is, "Rise up, O God, you inherit all nations." Um, and the idea is we've deposed the divine council. We've gotten rid of all the patron deities. Now Adonai, the God of Israel, will become God of all nations. And that way we can now access our deity in another nation, whether that's Egypt or Babylon or wherever. And that's the universalization of the God of Israel. And so the God of Israel has always been kind of their lodestar. This is the one who is guiding us. This is the one who is directing us. And whereas other nations get destroyed and that literature gets stopped, it gets cut off, it gets lost, and people develop other identities and they use other literature, the literature of the Hebrew Bible is preserved and is added on to. And so that scriptural heritage with that representation of Israel and their patron deity that is now universalized is still there. And so that's what they're going to use as their guide, as the compass for how they're going to understand their direction as an ethnic group. And so a lot of people talk about the Bible being this book unlike any other book, and therefore it's divine. And it is a book unlike any other book, because whereas all other nations at some point or another lost the heritage of their authoritative literature, the societies that use the Bible still have it all. Not all of it, but they still have much of it. And that scriptural heritage is always there as the foundation of how they understand their relationship to each other as a nation and to God. And so I think it's really historical accident that results in them maintaining this notion that we have this covenant relationship with God, and our identities are wrapped up in what God tells us to do.
How utterly fascinating that the worldview at the time was that the deity was kind of tied to the land. So the Egyptian gods could do their thing in the land of Egypt, and then the Greek gods could do their thing in the territories of ancient Greece. Because they were exiled, the Israelites, then they universalized, and their god could do his thing anywhere.
That was how they tried to make sense of it, so that they could preserve that heritage and that identity. And you see that reflected in a bunch of different ways. For instance, in some of the laws in Leviticus, it talks about, you will do this so that you can stay in the land. The nations that were in this land before you, I drove them out because they didn't do these things. And God is kind of saying, what I care about is this land. And so if you want to stay in the land, you're going to do what I tell you to do so that the land remains pure. And there's a story in the books of Kings about a Syrian general named Naaman, who comes down and he's healed by Elisha in the river Jordan. And he says, when I go back to Syria and I'm in the temple of my master, I want to worship Adonai, the God of Israel. And so he takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil back with him, basically saying, I want to worship the God that can only be worshipped on Israelite soil, so I'm going to take a chunk of Israel with me so that I can do that. The idea being that deity is only accessible on Israelite soil, and there are a bunch of other ways that that's reflected. But yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it gets preserved in a lot of different ways with this idea of this elect people that originally is associated with the land that is represented as the real elect part.
Do we know anything about how Yahweh I think you said Adonai, the God of the Israelites, first came into being, so to speak. I read somewhere that in the beginning he was some sort of a storm god. Maybe I have it wrong. One of the many gods worshipped in the Bronze Age Near East. Is there any truth to that?
Absolutely. The first evidence we have of any people group named Israel comes from something called the Merneptah stele, which is a 10-foot victory stele from Egypt that dates to around 1208, 1210 BCE. And on it, it says, it talks about these campaigns that the king has done, and it talks about some areas in Canaan. And then it says Israel's seed is not, and that they've been laid waste. And so this is the first reference to Israel. And there's a determinative. In Egyptian, you have to classify what type of noun this is. And the determinative identifies Israel as a people, not as a kingdom, not as a city state, not even as a city, but as a people. And so this is taken as evidence of the existence of this group known as Israel. But Israel means El contends. And El is the Northwest Semitic patriarchal high deity. So this is long beard, older deity, sits in a throne, rules, but is also benevolent and compassionate. We don't have any evidence of any deity named Adonai, YHWH, the Tetragrammaton, at all in any other nation around Israel until the Mesha inscription, which we already talked about, where Mesha boasts about defeating Israel at Nebo and carting off the vessels of Adonai. So by around 850, 825 BCE, Adonai seems to be the patron deity of Israel, but there's no record, there's no evidence of Adonai anytime before that period. We have a couple of other inscriptions date to around the same time period as the inscription of Mesha. One's called the Tel Dan stele or inscription, and there we have reference to some kings that an Aramaean named Hazael defeated, and they have Yahwistic theophoric elements in their name. So their names include references to Adonai. So like my name's Daniel, my judge is El. So that would be the theophoric element. And then we have this black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which refers to Jehu, which is also thought to have a Yahwistic theophoric element. And so the kings in this time period have Adonai's name in their names. So sometime between 1200-ish BCE and about 850 BCE, the main deity shifts from El, the patriarchal high deity, to Adonai. And if you look in the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible, you see two things. You see Adonai confronting Baal, another deity from this region. There's a lot of conflict between Adonai and Baal. And you see Adonai being represented in the same terms as Baal, as a youthful warrior storm deity. So these are two different divine profiles within the Northwest Semitic pantheon: the patriarch, the aged, wise, benevolent patriarchal high deity, and the angry, youthful warrior storm deity. And so what a lot of scholars think is that a group of people, perhaps associated with some people group that are referred to by the Egyptians as the Shasu, probably migrated into the region of the northern hill country around 1100, 1000 BCE, and brought with them their deity, who was probably named Adonai. And this deity, at some point, somebody probably either rose to the throne, became king, someone who was a follower, a devotee of Adonai, or someone who was king decided to adopt devotion to Adonai, and then they decided to engage in a campaign of conflation, where they would say Adonai and El are the same deity. And this is not unheard of. We see this occurring in the literature around this time and this place, where you have combined divine names. But for this one, they just said, no, they're the same deity, and we're going to refer to them as Adonai Elohim or something like that. So names like Joel mean Adonai is El. And so that would seem to be an attempt to assert that these two are the same deity. By the time we begin to see biblical texts arising and references to the patron deity of Israel, this campaign of conflation has probably already been completed, or at least mostly completed. But there's probably one text in the Hebrew Bible that might preserve an early distinction of the two. Deuteronomy 32 is one of these early. Well, the poem itself is not incredibly early, but it seems to preserve some very early things. And it says in Deuteronomy 32:7, it talks about Israel's relationship with Adonai. And then it says, ask your forefathers and they will tell you. Ask your fathers and they will say. And it goes on to say, when the Most High, which is a title for the high deity, divided up the nations, he divided the peoples according to the number of the children of God. And Adonai's portion was his people, Jacob, his share of the inheritance. And so some scholars suggest that, and I would agree with them, that what this text seems to be saying is that Adonai is the patron deity of Israel because they received Israel as an inheritance from another deity, from the Most High. And if we understand Elyon, the Most High, to be identified with El, the patriarchal high deity, then that would make sense of this likely initial relationship, that Adonai comes into the pantheon as the storm deity who is one of the children of the Most High God. And so the Most High God gave Adonai Israel as their inheritance, and this may pre-exist that conflation of the two deities. And so, yeah, as you look throughout the Hebrew Bible, you can see these two different divine profiles popping up in different places. Sometimes God is this aged, white-bearded, benevolent high deity sitting on a throne, and sometimes it is this youthful warrior who rides the storm clouds as their chariot and is associated with the lightning and the thunder. And those would be the profiles that were originally associated with the high deity El and with the storm deity Baal.
And what's the relationship between these two? Are they part of the same family, father and son, or like?
So when
we don't
look
know anything about that.
We have an idea, but it's not consistent. There are these texts that we call the Ugaritic texts that were discovered in a town that we call Ugarit, which is near the coast and further north in Syria. But these are texts that were written between around 1500 and 1200 BCE. The city was destroyed right around the time that we first have our first evidence of the existence of Israel. But these texts are written in a language very closely related to Hebrew, and they talk about a lot of the same characters. They talk about El, they talk about Leviathan, they talk about Baal. They have a lot of the same mythologies. And so in those texts, Baal is represented as either the son of El. He refers to El as his father in several places, but is also sometimes referred to as the offspring of another deity called Dagon, which probably comes from the Amorite pantheon. So it gets complex, but basically they represented their deities in a variety of different ways. Whatever was rhetorically useful, that's how they represented their deity. But Baal is probably understood within the Israelite understanding pantheon to be an alternative version of Adonai as one of the offspring, one of the children or sons of El. And Asherah. So Athirot is the name of El's consort, partner, or wife. In the Hebrew Bible, it's Asherah. And scholars think that in the earliest periods of Israel, Asherah was worshipped as God's wife. And we have iconography, we have inscriptions, we have a bunch of things that indicate God was thought to have a wife in the earliest periods of Israel's history.
A lot of the books of the Old Testament are purported to tell the history of the Israelites. We got, personalities. We got King David, King Solomon, various famous prophets and nation builders, etc. When were these figures, and maybe let's stick with King David, supposed to live? And is there any archaeological evidence testifying to the existence of any of these figures?
So so King David is right around the year 1000 BCE, and the earliest kind of evidence that we have for the existence of a historical David is that that Tel Dan Stele I mentioned earlier, because I mentioned that Hazael boasts about having defeated some Israelite kings, and then he mentions the name of a Judahite ruler and says that they're of the house of David, Beit Dawid. And so this is not a kingdom. It's not mentioned as a kingdom or a nation or anything like that. It's mentioned more as kind of a dynasty. And so this is interpreted by most scholars as evidence that at least 150 years after David was supposed to have lived, they knew about some kind of dynasty known as the House of David. And so that may be indirect historical evidence that somebody named David established a dynasty in the southern area of Judah around Jerusalem. And so some scholars reconstruct the start of the kingdom of Judah as maybe David tried to take over the throne from Saul in Israel and failed, and so went down south and took over Jerusalem and started up his own little chiefdom down there, and that turned into the kingdom of Judah, and he became King David. But initially, it was just a dynastic house. So that's the earliest evidence that we have for any kind of historicity that we might attribute to the historical timeline there. Now, I mentioned some Israelite kings. I mentioned Moab mentioned some Israelite kings. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, the third, mentions Jehu. So that's where we first get independent attestation of people mentioned in the Bible contemporary with the people themselves. So that would be the earliest direct evidence for their existence. And so it's right around that time period between 850 and 800 BCE that we begin to see direct historical attestation of these figures. And so what I normally say is more or less roughly around the time period of David, the text is going to be in very broad strokes accurate in terms of who's ruling where. That there probably was a Solomon of some kind. It was not a gigantic kingdom that put to shame everybody around them. It was probably a little chiefdom, but we get folks like Jeroboam and Rehoboam and the Omride dynasty and Jehu and Hazael and all these other folks, and those are probably historical figures. Now, all the stories that are being told about them, particularly that involve supernatural events, we have no data that support their historicity, and particularly where they conflict. But in terms of the names of rulers of nations, that begins to be historically accurate right there in the 9th century BCE. And most scholars would say that some of the early prophetic literature was probably written by people who were itinerant prophets who went around condemning the wealthy and the privileged for their oppression of the poor and the needy. So a handful of chapters in the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah are attributed to a historical Isaiah who lived in the 8th century BCE. And Hosea and Micah and Amos and others are examples of other prophetic figures that scholars think probably existed and preached around that time period as well.
That's more than I would have thought. I thought none of these folks actually existed. So a little bit of props there to the Old Testament.
Yeah, when we look at the Pentateuch, when we look at Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, that's all very much not supported by any data.
Okay, that was my next question, actually, about the Exodus, one of the most obviously striking and famous stories of the Old Testament. Moses leading the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery. Do Egyptian records confirm the historicity of this narrative at all, or at least a portion of it? What about...
Not at all.
Okay.
Not even a little bit.
I'm going to go lowest common kind of denominator. Were there Jewish slaves in Egypt at all at any point?
We have to be a little pedantic here. Jewish is a designation that wouldn't have existed at that time period. We probably can't speak of Jewish until we get down to 2nd century BCE. However, their ancestry, maybe. There were certainly Semitic peoples who were enslaved by the nation of Egypt and in Egypt. And there were actually Semitic peoples who ruled Egypt for a time, known as the Hyksos. So there were always there was always influence back and forth between Egypt and Semitic peoples, and they referred to them as the Asiatics in the Egyptian texts. We have absolutely no data whatsoever that indicate anyone from the northern hill country of Israel had been enslaved in Egypt and escaped. However, there are some theories that this tradition about this escape from slavery might be rooted in some kind of historical kernel where maybe a small group of people escaped and came back and started telling their story. And over the centuries, the fish just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it turned into what we have now. There's one scholar whose theory is that the tribe of Levi, the Levites, that was the tribe that escaped out of Egypt and made their way, and they're the ones who preserved the story, and they're the ones who passed it on. So that's one theory. Other scholars think that it originates in a social memory about a group escaping from slavery within the northern hill country itself. They didn't run off from another nation. They were enslaved by their neighbors, and the story just again grew and grew and grew into what we have now. But those are rather speculative reconstructions of what's going on. They're plausible, but we don't have enough data to be able to say one way or another they did or didn't happen. So that's part of the academic endeavor. We got to try and take some steps in the dark from time to time, and then see if maybe we discover data that allows us to confirm or deny any of
Fair
those
enough.
theories.
Yeah. Okay, this is going to be a tough one.
Okay.
What kind of morality is the Old Testament trying to relay or to teach its readers? If that is its purpose at all.
I don't think that's its main purpose. I think we have some moralizing literature in parts of the Hebrew Bible, but I think it's coming together primarily to structure power, to serve the interests of the palace and the temple and things like that. But we certainly have moralizing literature in like the Proverbs, and we have some contemplation of the problem of evil going on in like Job and Ecclesiastes and places like that. But when it comes to morality, I think it's changing over time. But for instance, in the book of Leviticus, we have what's known as the Holiness Code, which is a portion of the priestly literature, which was probably composed by people who either were priests or wish they were priests, who were very concerned for ritual purity. And so all of their concern, and some of this leaks into the other literature as well, is for ensuring that the people of Israel remain ritually pure. And so they come up with all these laws about what kinds of things create ritual impurities, and then they try to prohibit a lot of those. And so that's the only place where we see, for instance, the reference to any kind of same-sex intercourse is in the Holiness Code, which is a very late literary layer that is basically trying to say, hey, we want this land to be pure so we don't get kicked out of it again. And so we're going to make up all these rules. So that's guiding some of the morality. Some of the other morality is just associated with trying to distinguish us from them. So there's a scholar named David Graeber who in a recent book talks about schismogenesis, where you define your identity by identifying what's different from how you're different from your neighbor, and then that becomes your main identity marker. And so we see some of that as well. So things like avoiding pork, things like sanctifying the Sabbath day, not working on the Sabbath, things like that become kind of the way you show everybody around you that you belong to that identity and demonstrate your distinction from everybody else. So a lot of it has to do with a more collective kind of insular identity politics. But I think when we look throughout the Bible, we see a lot of different moral frameworks. We see a lot of different ways of approaching morality and identity, but a lot of it is boiling down to either structuring power and values and boundaries, or trying to prove to everybody else that you are a believing and you are a faithful member of the community. So a lot of it has to do with identity politics.
Does the afterlife feature in the Old Testament in any form? And if it does, how does it differ from the Christian concept of heaven?
There are a lot of folks who would say there's no afterlife within the Hebrew Bible. I don't think that's accurate. I don't, and I think the consensus view disagrees with that. And we have a couple of different ways to establish this. One is with a lot of references to Sheol. Sheol is the abode of all of the dead in the Hebrew Bible, and throughout the overwhelming majority of the Hebrew Bible, everybody goes to Sheol. Good, bad, everywhere in between, everyone ends up in Sheol, and it's kind of
That's
a
not very fair.
well, that's what ultimately ends up giving rise to the concepts of postmortem divine punishment and reward in the Greco-Roman period. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's kind of a murky existence. Nobody's sure exactly what it's going to look like, what kind of sociality was there. It's just understood to be kind of a gloomy place. However, from material remains, particularly how people were buried, how people were interacted with after their death, because you still have meals that are shared with the deceased. You have what are called mortuary chapels, where the living can go interact with the deceased. You have petitions that are made to the deceased. And even in the Hebrew Bible, you have things like Saul going to the necromancer of Endor to consult with the deceased prophet Samuel, who is called an Elohim, a god, when he shows up. And so there's a whole cult of the dead. And there's a wonderful book written by Carrie Sonia a couple years ago called Caring for the Dead in Ancient Israel, which is all about how the Hebrew Bible and the material remains outline what they thought about the dead and their relationship with them. But the dead were thought to have access to strategic knowledge. You could go petition them to help you with something, make a decision about something. You could petition them to harass your neighbor who, isn't returning your power tools and things like that. And you shared meals with them. And so there was probably ancestor worship going on alongside worship of God's wife and God and other deities in the earliest periods of Israel. And there's an argument to make, and I think a scholar named Susan Ackerman made it once in print, that one of the things that this King Josiah, who's probably responsible for the earliest layers of Deuteronomy, was trying to do was put a stop to all this other worship that was going on, not because he thought it wasn't legitimate worship, but because he wanted everybody to come to his temple to worship. So it's all about the Benjamins, even 2,700 years ago. And so there was worship of the ancestors. And that was probably, Deuteronomy was probably the initial volley trying to get rid of worship of the ancestors. And so we don't really know what all's going on with the afterlife. It's murky, it's unclear. It probably wasn't a great time. There are different entities that were thought to occupy the land of the dead, the Rephaim, the Yodeim. There are a bunch of entities that were thought to be there that they probably thought were dangerous to some degree. People are buried with what are called apotropaic amulets and things like that. Apotropaic means it wards off evil. So people carried those things around in life and would be buried with them to ward off whatever spookums might be in the afterlife. And what happens in the Greco-Roman period, I mentioned they're changing their worldview based on the fact that they seem to always be under the boot of larger empires. And as they're contemplating the problem of evil, why good things happen to bad people, why bad things happen to good people, they're not seeing the other shoe drop in life. And so the thought becomes, well, maybe it's after this life that God will finally settle the score and make everything right. And so in the Enochic literature, texts like First Enoch and related texts that were written in Aramaic and Greek in the Greco-Roman period Judaism, you have the development of this idea of these wicked angels that are being punished by God. And oh yeah, all the very wicked people in the world are being punished by God as well. And then the righteous people, which is always us, they are being rewarded in the afterlife. We've suffered so much in life. God is going to reward us in the afterlife. And it's not systematic, it's not consistent. But by the time we get to the New Testament, you have three general ideas of a post-mortem divine punishment: annihilationism, where they just cease to exist. There's temporary conscious torment, followed either by salvation or annihilation. So there were different ideas about what happened after that initial phase of divine punishment. And then there's eternal conscious torment. And the New Testament seems to represent, to some degree or another, all three different categories. But it's
Kind of
after the New
purgatory
Testament.
kind of thing.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is associated with this idea of I forget the word, apocastasis. Shoot, that's not the word. But there's this idea that you go and you get punished until you've paid your debt to God, and then you are purified or whatever. And some of that is in Gnostic ideology. Some people think Paul was a bit of a universalist, because Paul seems to say, like in 2 Corinthians, there's somebody in their community who is sleeping with their father's wife or something like that. And Paul says to cut him off, deliver him to the buffetings of Satan so that his soul can be saved in the last day, which seems to suggest that Satan is there to punish temporarily so that people can then be saved, which might be a universalist position. So all kinds of different perspectives on that are still developing in the New Testament, and it's really early Christianity that finally unifies it all and creates kind of a systematic notion of postmortem divine reward and punishment. But even that is further developed in the medieval period. Dante and others further add to the rich tapestry of all the different things that happen after death.
Okay, since we started talking about it, let's move on to the New Testament a little bit. We have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John discussing the life and teachings of Jesus. And then I believe we have the epistles and then the book of Revelation. But the first thing I want to know is, did any of the four evangelists actually hang out with Jesus at any point?
The data don't indicate that. And the scholarly consensus is that, well, one, the Gospels were initially written and circulated anonymously. Most scholars think that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John became associated with the Gospels decades after their initial composition. But two, none of the authors of those Gospels are thought to have been eyewitnesses. Some of them explicitly so. Like Luke explicitly says, I had to go look up the sources to try to put this together. But the scholarly consensus is that these were not eyewitnesses to the events that they're narrating.
I believe the earliest gospel is the Gospel of Mark, right?
Mm-hmm.
When was it written? How long after Jesus' death?
I think most scholars would say this was probably written between around 68 or 69 CE and 70, 71, 72 CE. So we're talking 35 to 40 years after the death of Jesus.
So the four gospels are basically telling the same story, right? But however, there are noticeable differences in the four narratives. You know probably better than anybody else, but there are some inconsistencies there, right?
Yeah,
Between the
absolutely.
four gospels. What are some of the most glaring or obvious ones that maybe are not easily resolved?
So three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic. The synoptic Gospels, which means see together, because they more or less follow the same narrative timeline. But within them, there are significant differences. For instance, the story of Jesus' birth, the nativity story in Matthew, is very specific. And then the one in Luke is entirely different. Matthew, they're in Bethlehem, gives birth. They've got to now I'm mixing up Matthew and Luke, but they in Luke there's a census and they're living in Nazareth. They have to come down to Bethlehem, and then they go back to Nazareth. In Matthew, they have to go into Egypt to escape from Herod. And the biggest problem is that the timelines don't fit, because the census that Luke says drove them or caused them to go down to Bethlehem to be registered, that didn't happen until 6 CE, 10 years after Herod died. And so the one in Matthew is placing this in the days of Herod, because Herod is the one who tries to kill everybody and tries to stop the king of the Jews from surviving. So I would say the nativities are just wildly contradictory between Matthew and Luke. And there are scholars who argue that they're not even original to Matthew and Luke. Luke, for instance, the nativity story is using very different Greek from the rest of the Gospel of Luke. And none of that story is ever mentioned ever again in Luke. And also Luke chapter 3 begins how we would expect the gospel to begin. It's like, in the days of this emperor, this person was governor. This is where we're laying our scene, so to speak. And so there's a case to make that the nativity scene that we see in Luke was something somebody else just added to the text after it had been written. So within the synoptic gospels, I would say that's probably the most glaring contradiction. Mark doesn't even mention it. Mark starts at Jesus's baptism. But then John is all on its own, because it's telling a very different story. It refers to some of the same events, but the synoptic gospels represent Jesus's ministry as being about 1 year. He is baptized. Around a year later, he's crucified and then resurrects. John represents a 3-year ministry, where Jesus is going back and forth between Jerusalem and Galilee multiple times. And so just the timeline between the two is different. But then the Gospel of John also represents some of these events according to very different timelines. When Jesus did his cleansing of the temple is different between the synoptics and John. When Jesus was anointed by this woman is different time periods between the synoptics and John. So the biggest differences would be between the synoptics and John, but even within the synoptics, there are pretty big differences as well.
And John was written the latest, right?
Maybe. Most people would say John was written probably in the 90s CE, but more and more scholars these days are suggesting that the Gospel of Luke may actually have been written in the 2nd century CE. So maybe Luke is the latest. But that's an ongoing debate.
I really wanted to ask you the following. What are some of the common misconceptions about the New Testament, and perhaps especially about what Jesus said or did, that perhaps we think is in there, but it's actually not, or vice versa?
There are a lot of sayings that are actually not anywhere in the text. They're like close to what might be in the text, but ideas about the golden rule are usually they're quoting other poetry or literature, not the Bible. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that the Gospels preserve the actual literal words of Jesus, which is almost certainly not true. To begin, the Gospels were all composed originally in Greek. So even if we do think something originally came from Jesus, we're only getting it in translation. We would have to revert back to Aramaic to see what Jesus might have said, and there are a bunch of different ways that could be done. But there are some things that very clearly are not translation, can't be translation, but must be original compositions in Greek. For instance, there are quotations of the Hebrew Bible that are put into the mouths of people speaking Aramaic, but they're directly quoting the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is different from the Hebrew. And they're quoting, and like the message that they're trying to deliver only exists in the Greek translation. For instance, there is the Council at Jerusalem, which happens in the book of Acts. And this is after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. They're getting together to try to decide, are we going to require Gentiles who become Christians to be circumcised and to have to accept all of these rules that Jewish people culturally follow? And they decide that's not going to be the case. And the last person to speak is James, Jesus's brother. And he says, I like this. this agrees with what was spoken by the prophets. And he quotes a passage from Amos, but he misquotes it. It's not what's in the Hebrew, it's what's in the Greek mistranslation. Because the Hebrew says, and we will repossess the remnant of Edom, basically saying we're going to reconquer the territory that we had under the kingdom of David. We're going to repossess all of this territory. But the verb repossess was misunderstood as a verb that looks very similar in Hebrew, the verb for seek. And then the word Edom is spelled very close to the word Adam, which means people or human. And so when you look in Acts 15, what James quotes is, and the remnant of humanity will seek after the Lord, and the tent, and this tabernacle of David will be rebuilt. The idea being that all of humanity will seek after the Lord, and so we need to extend the gospel to all of humanity. But that whole message only exists in the Greek mistranslation. It's not in the Hebrew, which means this cannot be a verbatim account of what James would have said to this council in Jerusalem in Aramaic. It can only be something composed in Greek. And so that's an example of one way where we can see this is not historical, because this is something that's only working in Greek. And there are other more arguable examples of similar things going on with Jesus, where Jesus is saying stuff that only makes sense in Greek, not in Aramaic or in Hebrew.
I recently watched The Sound of Music again. I love that movie.
Great
And
movie.
in it, the fantastic movie. And in it, the sort of the main nun says, when I don't know if she says Jesus or God, when God closes the doors, he opens the window. Is that in the Bible?
No, that's not in the Bible anywhere. I know one that for whatever reasons I keep seeing it, and I think it has a lot to do with the toxic masculinity of Christian nationalism. But
Yeah.
the idea of the lamb and the lion laying down together, like in that day, everything will be peaceful, the lion and the lamb, that doesn't occur anywhere in the Bible. It's the lamb and the wolf. But there are a lot of people with bumper stickers that say lions, not sheep. In the U.S., a bunch of toxic masculinity going on, and they would really like it to be about lions, but that's one of those kind of false memories that has just proliferated because people remember it that way, and it's not anywhere in the text.
This is a biggie. Does Jesus ever explicitly proclaim himself the Son of God anywhere in the Bible?
I would argue no. And I know this is not the consensus view, but I think it's a growing view. And I know a lot of critical scholars who would agree with me. But Jesus does things that only God is supposed to be able to do. And Jesus identifies with titles that are titles explicitly of God in the Hebrew Bible. And some people will argue, okay, in doing those two things, Jesus is showing that he is God. I and many other critical scholars would say, no, Jesus is doing what other mediatory figures did in Greco-Roman period Judaism, only he's being more forceful about it. They're showing that they have been endowed with divine authority, and even with the ability to manifest the divine presence by virtue of possessing the divine name. And so Jesus is only doing what other mediatory figures before him within Greco-Roman period Judaism, the angel Yahweh, Melchizedek, the Son of Man in the Enochic literature, others do what God does, bear God's titles, and are even receiving worship because they are this special mediatory figure. And so Jesus is doing the same thing. And so I think the idea for the authors of the New Testament is, hey, Jesus is this mediatory figure. And I argue in my own book, Adonai's Divine Images, which is an open access book that's freely available online, that this is basically representing Jesus as a divine image. Because a divine image is supposed to manifest the divine presence so that you can do whatever you need to do in God's presence. But it's not the God. but it can be referred to as if it's the God. So Jesus is functioning, in my opinion, in the exact same way, and we actually see the angel of the Lord functioning in this exact same way in the Hebrew Bible. So I go into a lot more detail about that argument in my book, and I'm going to be working on a forthcoming book that will lay that whole argument out about early Christology. But explicitly saying I am God, no, Jesus never does that.
So
There
not
is
even
one
in your right. Please go ahead.
there is one figure who says I am God, who is not God in the Bible, and that's the angel of the Lord. In Exodus 3, Moses sees the burning bush, turns aside, and it says that the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire in the midst of the bush. And then that angel in verse 6 says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So that is a figure that is not God, that explicitly says, I am God. Jesus, by the time of Jesus, the tradition of these intermediatory figures is a little more nuanced. And so they kind of wink at you and say, ooh, I have the divine name, and that kind of stuff. And so that's what Jesus does. But Jesus never is as explicit as the angel of the Lord is in Exodus 3:6.
So if I understood correctly, not even is Jesus not saying I am God, not even the four evangelists were saying that he is God.
No, we do have in John 20:28, we have the doubting Thomas who says, "My Lord and my God," to Jesus. Now, what I argue is going on here is that uh, Jesus earlier in the Gospel of John, in fact, in John 1:18, we have this statement: "The only Son who is at the side of God, he manifests God," or something like that. And the idea in the Gospel of John that the disciples don't get until the very end is, if you see me, you have seen God, exactly as a divine image works. I manifest the divine presence. And so if you see me, you have seen God. And so I argue that Thomas in John 20:28, when Thomas says to Jesus, my Lord and my God, Thomas gets it. The light bulb comes on and Thomas realizes, you are the manifestation of God's presence. And so in that sense, calls Jesus God, but not quite in the sense of Jesus actually is God. More like Jesus is like a divine image who manifests God's presence.
Okay, does Jesus in any of the four gospels ever say anything about homosexuality?
No. And there are people who point to Matthew 19 and say, well, Jesus quoted Genesis 2:24, and Jesus said that, what God has put together, let no man divide asunder. And so Jesus is, defining marriage as between one man and one woman. And so that is against homosexuality. And that is a very creative but very nonsensical overinterpretation of what Jesus is saying, because Jesus is just talking about divorce and is quoting Genesis 2:24 to say God wants these pair bonds, and so don't break those bonds because God wants them. So that has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with homosexuality. But there's also the question of what we mean precisely by homosexuality, because if we're talking about a sexual orientation, attraction to the opposite sex, they had no concept of a sexual orientation in the ancient world that has absolutely anything to do with how we understand that concept today. So if we use homosexuality to mean the orientation, the Bible never says anything at all about it. If we use it to refer to the act of same-sex intercourse, we have some references in Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, in Romans 1, in 1 Corinthians 6, and in 1 Timothy, specifically about the act, but they're represented in different ways. None of them is Jesus talking. They're represented in different ways, and they're rationalized according to wildly outdated and irrelevant worldviews and notions of what exactly is the problem with these kinds of actions. So the notion that everything can just be wholesale transferred to today and just overlaid on our notion of homosexuality and homosexual relationships today is wildly problematic, and I would argue is just based in the desire to structure power and values and boundaries. And unfortunately, it is a matter of life and death for some people, but some people cannot be made to care.
Well said. Does Jesus talk about hell?
Jesus does mention Gehenna, which is one of the three words that we see in the New Testament that are sometimes translated hell. Gehenna and Hades are the two main ones, and then one that only occurs once in one of the epistles of Peter is Tartarus. But Jesus does talk about Gehenna, Hades. Jesus talks about post-mortem divine punishment. And so it's actually in the Gospels where you get most of the occurrences. You'll recall I mentioned that in the New Testament, we have those three different ideas about post-mortem divine punishment. It's actually in the mouth of Jesus that we get the most common references to the idea of eternal conscious torment. But it's also inconsistent. Jesus seems to be representing a few different perspectives.
Now, if we take Bible as a whole, is there anything you could think of in there that is kind of freaky in the sense that it's mentioned in there, but a person from that period and place shouldn't really have knowledge of it? You know, like, I don't know, does the Bible mention South America or the dinosaurs, for example?
Yeah. No, there's nothing there's nothing supernatural. There's nothing where we are like, how can they know about that? They should know about that. However, one interesting thing is you see a lot about people arguing that in Ezekiel and Revelation and everything, that we have these end times prophecies about China and Iran and Russia. And all that is just pure and
In the
utter
Bible?
nonsense. Yeah.
Okay.
But there is a paper that was just published in a very well-respected academic journal arguing that China is in the Bible. And it makes an interesting argument. Now, it's not saying the People's Republic of China. It's not saying the current government. But there is a reference in Isaiah 49:12 to the land of Sinim. And the context indicates that this is a land that's far off to the east. And a lot of scholars have said, oh, this is actually supposed to be Aswan, which is a region in southern Egypt on the Nile. And this article that just came out this month in this journal is arguing, no, this is a reference to China. The earliest etymologically related word is the Greek word sine, which is like sinim, a masculine plural gentilic, a reference to a people. And this is referenced over a dozen times by Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE book called Geography, which seems to place it far off into the east as well. And so there is an argument that is now being made that the region of China, as it was known anciently, is referenced in the Bible, which is one that kind of threw me for a loop for a little bit. But in terms of things they would have had no way of knowing, no, there's nothing like that in the Bible.
Yeah, but it's not, like you said, the current country of China. That would have been something if like Xi Jinping it like pops up in the Bible.
Yeah, no names of dynasties, just this generic reference to a people group that that probably aligns with the designations for China that were used anciently for that region of the world.
Before the interview, I did a little Google search. Couldn't help myself, and there was a lot of claims of scientific knowledge in the Bible from certain, believers in certain sites, Christian sites. I recently read, there was an article on a Christian site that said that Genesis explicitly mentions the first law of thermodynamics. So does the Bible contain a secret trove of scientific knowledge?
No, not even remotely. This is people trying to read in current scientific thinking into poetic turns of phrase and things like that are just vague enough that we can kind of import our ideas into them. Because you do have a concept of God trying to impose order upon chaos. The idea, and this is something common to the creation myths of the ancient world, is that initially everything was just kind of chaotic, indeterminate water, and
some sort of sludge.
Yeah, the process of creation was a process of giving order to that chaos. And so that is found in Mesopotamia, it's found in Anatolia, it's found in Egypt, it's found all over long before the Bible. But some people look at that and think, this is the idea of thermodynamics. And so God is necessary to overcome entropy, and that is why we have order, because God put it there. And that's just reading contemporary thinking back into a text that did not have any such understanding whatsoever.
Okay, we have to draw to a close. It's such an interesting conversation, but I wanted to save the sassiest bit for the end. What's the deal with Satan? Like, when I was growing up, when I was going to Catholic school, sometimes he was a scary dude. Sometimes it was like actually what people did. Sometimes it was referenced like some sort of evil energy, or some sort of a worldview. How does the Satan or Lucifer or whatever feature in the Bible?
So in the Hebrew Bible, Satan is a title. It means adversary, or something like that, and it is used to refer to anyone who takes an adversarial position against anyone else. So humans are described in the Bible as a Satan. Even the angel of the Lord,
Satan.
when Satan is the Hebrew word, yeah. Even the angel of the Lord, when they confront Balaam in Numbers 22, it says the angel of the Lord stood as a Satan against Balaam.
Sorry, who's
And so
Balaam?
Balaam is the prophet that the king of I think is it Barak? There's a foreign king who
Okay,
hires Balaam to curse Israel in the book of Numbers.
I see. All right, got it.
And Balaam is like, I'm going to do whatever God tells me to do. And there's a part where Balaam's riding a donkey, and the angel of the Lord with a drawn sword confronts him, and the donkey ends up talking because the donkey can see the angel and Balaam can't. But the angel of the Lord is a Satan. And then in places like Zechariah and the book of Job, the title has a definite article on it, the Satan. And here it seems to be understanding the Satan not as an identity, but as a role that a specific divine being has within the divine pantheon, the divine council, kind of like a prosecuting attorney. So their responsibility is to kind of bring charges against humans and things like that. So in Job, you have the Satan coming before God's throne with all of the children of God, and God saying, "Hey, have you checked out Job? He's a real one." And the Satan, the prosecuting attorney, saying, "I bet I can trip him up." So in the Hebrew Bible, it's not the name of a specific individual. It's just a role or a title. In the Enochic literature, when you have this story of a lead malevolent angel convincing all these other malevolent angels to come down to earth and to have intercourse with human women and to introduce all of evil to humanity, so it's accounting for the problem of evil, then you get this idea of a head malevolent angel, and their names, they have a bunch of different names. Sometimes it's Shemihazah, sometimes it's Azael, sometimes it's Azazel, sometimes it's Melchirashah, sometimes it's Mastema. It's a bunch of different names, and this becomes kind of the template for what we see in the New Testament, where this individual now has the name Satan. And the New Testament is kind of consolidating all of the bad characters from the Hebrew Bible in this divine profile. So Lucifer is not identified as Satan or as an evil divine figure anywhere in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament. Lucifer is just a sarcastic demeaning of a Babylonian king. The serpent from the Garden of Eden is not identified as Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, anywhere in the New Testament. That's another post-biblical identification. The New Testament identifies Leviathan as Satan in the book of Revelation, where it's this great seven-headed red dragon who falls from the skies and sweeps down a third of the stars of heaven with their tail. So you're taking a bunch of different figures and you're mushing them together in kind of this grab bag of evil that we're now going to name Satan. And that's kind of how that concept has functioned ever since then. If something is bad, oh, it's satanic. We have the Saturday Night Live church lady. Could it be Satan? And today I get a lot of people on Twitter who accuse me of being satanic, and the same thing on TikTok. I am satanic, and it's because Satan is just the kind of mental exemplar representation of everything that is evil. And you see that already in the New Testament with kind of drawing in all these different figures, and they're all squished together, and they're Satan. And so it's a malleable concept that we can just add all this stuff to, and it becomes kind of a very useful little tool to try to draw lines between good and evil in whatever way serves our interests.
Is it similar with demons? Or is that a whole other thing? Because, like half of scary movies are about exorcisms, which is a
Yeah.
rich tradition in Catholicism, I suppose.
Yeah, you don't really have demons in the Hebrew Bible, but there are concepts of spirits that can penetrate your body and cause you illness and take over your executive functions. Like, they can enter in the ears, and women during menstruation are particularly susceptible to them getting through the integrity of their body. And so you see that in Mesopotamia and Egypt and elsewhere. You don't really see it in the Hebrew Bible, but once you get to the Greco-Roman period, where they've got a lot of concepts of daimonis, you get Christianity kind of adopts the Greco-Roman perspective, and so you get demonic possession within Christianity. And so it's a bit of a different story, but it kind of dovetails nicely with an idea that you see in the book of Enoch, where these malevolent angels came down and they had children with human women, and those children were giants. And the giants had children, and the children were Nephilim. The Nephilim, and the giants died, and when they died, their spirits became the evil spirits that are demons that possess people and all that kind of stuff. So you do have a narrative way to account for it in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature. But
Well,
yeah,
that's crazy. I've never heard about that before, especially not in Catholic school, that there were giants and people having demons having sex with women and their children were giants and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
The
wow.
Book of Enoch was very influential within early Judaism and even within early Christianity, and it's even quoted in the Epistle of Jude. They quote directly from the Book of Enoch. However, by the 3rd, 4th century CE, most the intellectual Christians were kind of like, we're kind of sick of the Book of Enoch, and so it gets dumped, and so it does not form part of the canon. However, the reason we know as much as we do about the Book of Enoch is because there were some missionaries who took the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, including First Enoch, down to what was then known as the Kingdom of Aksum, and introduced Christianity to the royal household there. And that is what we now know of as Ethiopia. And so the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church still has the Book of Enoch as part of their canon. And our earliest manuscripts of the full Book of Enoch are all Ethiopic manuscripts. So it was preserved within one church's canon.
Okay, I don't want to drag you into politics, but over there in the States, you've got presidential elections coming up again, and that provides a lot of, let's say, memorable content for the entire planet. One of the funniest moments, I thought, at least, during the previous election cycle was when a journalist asked Donald Trump what his favorite Bible verse was. And Trump replied, I don't want to talk about that because that's really personal, so I don't want to get into verses, but the Bible means a lot to me. And then the journalist asked, are you a New Testament guy or an Old Testament guy? And Trump said, probably equal. So, I mean, that's really amusing in the sort of the cat ate my homework type of moment. Do you think that Donald Trump, unlike me, actually read the Bible?
Oh, I'm sure at some point or another he's cracked a biblical spine, but I wanted that reporter to say, name a verse, just quote a verse, because he so clearly would not have been able to, because he clearly doesn't have any clue what he's talking about and is just trying to be as generic as possible and just trying to seem as if he's right in the middle. He agrees with everybody, but he clearly has no idea what he's talking about because he is a laughably stupid adult.
Dr. McClellan, are you a New Testament or an Old Testament guy?
I'm a Hebrew Bible guy primarily. That is the text that most of my research has focused on. That's where I did most of my degrees focused on Hebrew Bible. And I'm mostly interested in the New Testament to the degree that it shows the developments from the Hebrew Bible. So yeah, I'm a Hebrew Bible guy myself.
What's your favorite passage in the Bible and why?
I think I really enjoy Deuteronomy 32:8 just because there's so much in there. The possibility that this preserves an early distinction between Elyon and Adonai is fascinating. I think that's a wonderful passage. There are a handful of others that I think from like a moral inspirational point of view are cool. But in terms of the one that I whenever I pick up a new translation of the Bible, the first verse I turn to is always Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 because I want to see how they handled that verse.
Thank you so much for this conversation. What a delight. Where can people follow your work? You do have social media, I know.
I do. I go by at McClellan, and that's my last name spelled phonetically, McLellan, on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter, also on Blue Sky and on Threads. I co-host with my friend Dan Beecher, the Data Over Dogma podcast, where we do the same thing I try to do on social media, increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combat the spread of misinformation about the same. We have episodes that come out every Monday. We're on YouTube as well as on all of the podcast aggregate sites. And then I also have a website, McClellan.org, spelled like my username, where I occasionally teach online classes and have online classes that I've taught in the past for sale there as well. And then I will have a trade book coming out soon called The Bible Says So, where I address whether or not the Bible does say all the things people claim it says. That's hopefully we'll have pre-orders and a cover and everything out within the next couple of months. So I'm very much looking forward to getting that out in the public.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much. This was
Well,
amazing.
thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Wonderful questions.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing to Smart Cookies on YouTube. What else is there? Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you really like what you heard, feel free to become my Patreon. No, my patron on Patreon by going to Patreon and becoming my patron. It's really easy. Just type Smart Cookies Podcast in there. You should be able to find me. Last but not least, I have to thank the absolute legends that are my producers on this show, my existing patrons on Patreon: Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medino, Gordon, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Mila, Carmen, Taichi, Goran, and Veronica. Without you guys, this show wouldn't exist. So massive thanks. And yeah, see you in the next episode. Bye.